It began with a letter, a thin envelope stamped by the Selective Service, a name typed neatly at the top. Inside, a draft notice. For millions of young Americans in the 1960s, that envelope was more than paper. It was a sentence. You were going to Vietnam. The draft had existed since World War II, but Vietnam was different. This was not the war of their fathers, the war against fascism, against Hitler, against enemies whose evil was plain for the world to see. Vietnam was something else, a tangle of politics, a Cold War chess match, a jungle struggle in a land most Americans couldn't even find on a map. Yet the war machine demanded fuel. By the mid-1960s, more than 8,000 young men every month were being drafted, trained, and shipped overseas. Some could escape. If you were in college, you could delay service. If you had money or connections, you could dodge it entirely. But for working-class kids, the sons of farmers, factory workers, bus drivers, there was no escape. For Black and Hispanic communities, the burden was even heavier. And slowly, the realization spread. This war was not being fought by America's sons equally. The resistance began not with bullets, but with fire. On October 15, 1965, in New York City, David Miller became the first man arrested for publicly burning his draft card. He stood before a crowd, pulled the small piece of government-issued cardboard from his pocket, held it high, and set it ablaze. The flames consumed his future, his obedience, and in that moment lit a movement. Soon it spread. In Boston, students gathered in Harvard Yard, chanting as hundreds of cards went up in smoke. In San Francisco, protesters burned them outside draft board offices. The act was illegal, punishable by prison, but it was powerful. It said, "We will not fight this war, not for you, not for them." The government called it cowardice, the protesters called it conscience, and the spark grew into fire. If the movement had a heartbeat, it was in the music. Bob Dylan sang of masters of war. Joan Baez stood on stages and refused to pay her taxes, her own money becoming an act of resistance. Jimi Hendrix bent the strings of his guitar until they screamed, then lit it on fire at Monterey, a mirror of napalm falling half a world away. And then came the anthems that every radio, every turntable carried into America's living rooms. Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. It Ain't Me, I Ain't No Senator's Son. Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon, a chorus sung by thousands at once, echoing across protests from Washington to London. Music became more than entertainment. It was defiance. Every lyric another weapon, every chorus another march. The war was no longer confined to Vietnam. It was in the airwaves. It was in the streets. It was in the soundtracks of the very generation being sent to die. The resistance found its strongest footing where the young gathered, the universities. At the University of Michigan, students staged the first teach-in. For an entire night, professors held lectures, not on textbooks, but on the cost of war, its politics, its casualties, its lies. In California, the free speech movement at Berkeley morphed into full-throated resistance. Campus plazas filled with chants, signs, and arrests. Across the country, campuses became battlegrounds. At Columbia University, students occupied entire buildings, unfurling banners from the windows. In Wisconsin, police stormed into protests with tear gas and batons. In dozens of towns, ROTC buildings were set aflame, their walls blackened with smoke. Draft board offices were raided, files dragged into the street, smeared with blood or burned to ash. To the protesters, this was democracy alive. To those in power, it was anarchy unleashed. Television carried it all into American living rooms. The war in Vietnam was already the first living room war. Jungles, firefights, body counts shown on the evening news. But now the battle spread into America's own streets. Images flickered across screens, long-haired kids with fists raised, police with helmets and batons, National Guardsmen with rifles leveled. For Middle America, it was shocking. Who were these kids? Why were they spitting on the flag, burning their cards, screaming at soldiers? President Richard Nixon dismissed them with a single word: bums. But to millions of young Americans, they were heroes, standing up against a war that had already consumed more than 50,000 American lives. The United States was no longer united. It was a nation at war with itself. On May 4th, 1970, in Ohio, everything broke. At Kent State University, students gathered to protest the invasion of Cambodia, the war spreading wider instead of ending. The National Guard was deployed. Young soldiers, barely older than the students they faced, carrying rifles with bayonets fixed. The crowd swelled, chanting, jeering, throwing rocks. Tear gas hung in the air. Then came the command. Then came the gunfire. 13 seconds, 67 bullets. When the smoke cleared, 4 students were dead. 9 more were wounded. 1 was shot through the head, another through the chest. None of them carried weapons. None of them posed a mortal threat. The photographs that followed seared themselves into history. A young woman kneeling over a fallen body, her face twisted in a scream that would never fade. The war in Vietnam had claimed thousands of lives, but now it had claimed its own children, on American soil. Kent State shocked the world. Hundreds of campuses across the nation shut down. Millions of students went on strike. Even those who had stayed silent could no longer look away. In Washington, lawmakers scrambled to defend the war. But the truth was plain. The draft itself was collapsing. By 1973, it was gone. The United States shifted to an all-volunteer military. But the scars of the draft and the protests remained. They linger still, in songs, in photographs, in the memories of a generation that refused to be silent. The Vietnam War was fought in jungles half a world away, but it was also fought at home, in burning cards, in midnight songs, in tear gas and gunfire. It was fought by those who refused to march quietly into a war they did not believe in. And it proved a lesson, one written not in victory or defeat, but in protest, that when a nation forces its children into silence, they will answer with fire. And that, like so many stories we uncover here on the Dusty Ledger, is history's reminder that the past is never truly past. It lingers, written in smoke, in screams, in silence.